Welcome to Bible Believers Fellowship and our study of the book of Daniel. In this study, we are in chapter 11 and verses 33 through 35, where we come to the prophesied future of Israel, when Jews will be persecuted and mistreated for what has now been nearly 2,000 years. We now join with Bible believers for this important study in the book of Daniel, The Gap, Daniel chapter 11, verses 33 through 35. And that picks up where after the Maccabean revolt and into the time when actually Jesus would come. And you remember in Daniel 9 it was said that when the Messiah would come, he would be cut off, but not for himself. All that is interconnected with what we're going to read here. And you may wonder why I have the yellow star up there, and that's because that kind of represents to Daniel what he was looking at. See, when you and I think of the gap between Jesus' first coming and his second coming, we think of the church. If you're a Jew, that's what you think of. For 2,000 years, that's what the gap has meant to them. And so keep that in mind as we continue, but that's why I put that on there. But what's amazing as we study Daniel 11:33 is we've talked about there's places where even a colon in your English Bible represents this church age, a time period of 2,000 years. We've looked at that in Isaiah before. Here is an example where the second half of verse 33 covers an entire age, which we would call the church age. Look at verse 33, and it begins, "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days." We come off of the Maccabean revolt, and there was this time period where there were those who understood. Do you remember when John the Baptist was born? You remember his dad? What was his dad's name? Zacharias. And remember he kind of doubted like Sarah, and so God made him mute until, or the biblical term dumb, he couldn't talk until John was born, and then the first thing he said was his name is John. Well, Zacharias was one of those who understood, but do you remember some of the others? There's a woman that, and I'm not going to go there because I want you to read this, do your own research, but see how many of you remember. Anna? Remember Anna? She was one of those that understood. And there was another, the priest, who was the one who held Jesus? Remember? It basically said, "Now I can die. I've seen your salvation, Lord." See, look what you're doing. You're getting in the Bible. Isn't that great? So see, and go ahead and keep looking, but while I'm talking, but these are the people being talked about here. There would be some who would understand, and they would be watching. Who else? Who do we always celebrate coming from the east? The wise men, the Magi, which we don't know if there were three, by the way. We didn't even mention that this year. Did you say three? I didn't hear you. Sorry. I'm not rebuking you. I just said they came bearing three gifts, but we're not sure they were just three wise men. But anyway, they understood. But you know what? They came from Babylon. They understood the book of Daniel. That's why they showed up. And who else, you remember, they didn't quite understand from Scripture, but the shepherds, who were actually showed up. The wise men showed up when Jesus was probably about 2 years old, I think. We think from the Scripture, but the shepherds were there at the birth of Jesus. Did you find out? Simeon. Yeah. And that's my paraphrase. He says, "I can die now. I've seen your salvation." So that's who that is talking about there in the first half. We see that the Maccabean age that then led up to the time of Jesus Christ. The Maccabean revolt won back, to an extent, the Holy Land and the temple, and so they were able to continue on with the whole temple sacrifice and the temple system and the priesthood and the scribes' teaching. Sadly, coming out of Babylon, they corrupted that. And every time you see Jesus saying, by your traditions you've made the word of God of none effect, he's talking about the Babylonian Talmud. They came back, but sadly they brought things with them they shouldn't have. But there still were some who understood. And that's what that's saying. Now, that's covering a period from 400 BC, right about, to 70 AD. Your Old Testament closes around 400 AD, BC. I was afraid I had it wrong up there. Your Old Testament closes around 400 BC, and right past the time of Jesus up to 70 AD, that's where those people fit in. People who understood, and they instructed many, it says. Yet, the second half of Daniel 33 covers to a Jew. Remember, this is about Daniel and his people. We want to bring our perspective in, but this is about Daniel and his people, and that's called the dispersion or diaspora. The dispersion. Now, when a Jew comes home, do you know what they call that? Aliyah. And that's basically saying you're coming home from the dispersion, from being dispersed all over the world. Spell it. A-L-I-Y.
Aliyah, A-L-Y-A-H or something. You see it in the Jewish newspaper if you read that.
Yeah, I think it's A-L-I-Y-A-H. Yeah. And that's the prayer for 2,000 years when the Jews would celebrate Passover, and they would say, next year, Jerusalem. Well, a lot of them have been in Jerusalem, since 1948 especially. So it's coming to an end, but that's what that last half of verse 33 is referring to, is this time of dispersion. Let's look at there. Let me see. Did I go? Yeah. Look, it says, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. That started in 70 AD. That's after they'd rejected Jesus Christ, and the whole book of Acts is played out, and Acts ends fairly close to that time when Titus, the Roman general, came down into Israel, destroyed everything. There was still some of the city and temple left, and in 135 there was another revolt, and they leveled everything to what you see today. But all of that really started in 70 AD, and I got 2 and then 3 question marks. I'm hoping that it's 2012. I'd love for the Lord to come back this year. That's our new radio ad. If you listen on WHKC, I'll let you just listen to it. You tell me if you hear it. But I'm hopeful, but it could happen anytime, but it may be a few years. I hope we don't have to add a 1 there to 2100 something, but if my calculations are correct, we're not going to have to do that. But this is an amazing prophecy right there, because if you take that portion of verse 33, look at it closely before I show you Luke 21:24. But in Daniel 11:33, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Look at it. Sword, captivity, many days. Look what Jesus said in Luke 21:24. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive. Exactly the same thing. And Jesus is talking about Jerusalem after he ascends to heaven. And that's exactly what Daniel's pointing to. The dispersion. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. We're going to see in a minute. Daniel refers to that as the time appointed. So you can see there's no mistaking Daniel and Jesus complementing each other. Just like we said so many times, there's no mistaking Daniel and the book of Revelation. And if you've never done that, do it. sit down and read the 12 chapters of Daniel and the 21 chapters of Revelation. And 21, right? 22. Oh, I'm having a brain lapse here. 22. Yeah, it's 22, 18, 19 of the warning not to remove anything, and I'm just getting ready to cut off a chapter. But but if you've never, get Alexander Scorby's DVD or something and play that thing and go through Daniel and then go through Revelation. Now, it'll take you about 2.5, 3 hours to do that. So you may have to space it out over a couple of days or something. But can I tell them? Jenny had Jenny come in on New Year's Eve, and she'd been walking the dog, and it's kind of cold, and was it raining too? Something got her all fired up about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and she says, "Greg, I got this idea. I know what we can do to bring in the new year. Let's all sit around the circle and read through the book of Revelation." Now, you have to understand, 9 o'clock, she turns into a pumpkin. And I said, "Jenny," I said, "that'd take you about 3 hours." And I looked up, Scorby takes him about an hour and 45 minutes. And that's what, he don't have to drink and breathe. You know, it's on tape. And I said, "That's going to take us, we have to start like at 10 o'clock. And I said, "Besides, it's going to be at midnight. I mean, and what time did you go to bed?"
10:30. Oh, he didn't.
It's just, she's cute. But anyway, so make plans ahead not to try to do this at midnight. But pick a time when you know you can do it and sit and read, and it's amazing. Now, I want to show you this, and I still have not forgotten that I'm going to have these printed out.
Thank you.
And every one of you are about ready to stone me, but I have so much help now. I'm getting so much done now that I know I'm going to be able to keep that promise this year. But the period of time that we're talking about here is the 400-year silence is the first half of verse 33. And then that second half, we look at this and we see church age, and we think happy thoughts. But what Daniel and Jesus were talking about is the being slain by the sword, being held captive, being in captivity. Folks, the truth is, even though they were free in Germany, they were free in Poland for certain times here and there, in between the pogroms and the persecutions, but they were always in captivity because that's not their home. When that crazy lady, what's her name, Helen Thomas, tells the world that the Jews should all go back to Germany and back to Poland where they're from and let the Palestinians have that land, that woman's nuts. Not only she's crazy, but she's against God. Because they were in captivity in Poland. They are in captivity in America. That's hard for us to really get. I don't want to see the Jews leave here until after the rapture, by the way. I'm not pushing them out the door. But you know what? It's interesting. Your Old Testament ends, my Old Testament ends with a voice crying in the wilderness, "Make straight the paths of the Lord." Do you know the Jewish Old Testament in Hebrew, the Masoretic Hebrew text, the book order ends with 2 Chronicles telling them to go back to Jerusalem. Isn't that amazing? A Jew picks up a Hebrew Bible and reads it. It ends with them being told to go back home. Why? Because no matter where they're at, they are in captivity. And it's just something that is sobering is, even in America, Jeremiah says that when the time of the end comes, God will send a hunter to hunt them and drive them back into their land. That's the role of the Antichrist. So, that'll be printed out for you to use as a guide. But I wanted to quote Clarence Larkin. If you ever find his books on a good bargain, buy them. Mike got them all on digital for about $5. But I'm not good at reading on the computer. I need a old-fashioned page turner, I like to highlight and mark up and dog ear and all that stuff. Spill some coffee on it. So Clarence Larkin, though, in his book on Daniel says, quote, "Here," the verse we just reading, We have the meaning and purpose, think of this, of all the afflictions and persecutions of the Jews down the centuries and even unto the end, outlined in one verse. Think of that. That's an amazing thing to be said about that verse we just read. All the meaning and purpose of the afflictions and persecution of the Jews down through the centuries. That's just a heavy thought. So then the next two verses we're going to read are a summarization. They summarize the general and constant reality of Jewish history for 2,000 years. Folks, there are exceptions where Jews for a little while would get along. That is the exception. They say the exception proves the rule. Why? Because that's what makes it an exception. It's not the rule. And the rule is persecution. So in verse 34, notice he says when and not if. Read that with me. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Now that's a word that should not have fallen out of use in regular daily language. Holpen. I like that. But what that means is that they will be helped. But it's more than a past tense. It's a past and present and continuous state. So it's a word that we don't use very often, but it's a fitting word because if you just use the word helped, it doesn't carry with it. You're talking about 2,000 years where they've been helped with a little help. Now, don't skip over through or just think through that without understanding. He says what he means. Very little help. Basically what that's telling you is they'll be helped with just enough help to survive. And that's exactly what's happened for 2,000 years. It's like they say with friends like these, who needs enemies? You just think about how God has provided that help. And I don't want to jump right in and give you the answers, but have you studied Jewish history? Very many of you studied the history of the Jews for 2,000 years, or at least the last 150 years, or since Zionism really kind of started around 1880. It's amazing, but here's a few examples of what I would say is a little help. Number one, under Islam. Now this is going to sound like you say, this doesn't sound like help, but in reality, it's the little help being talked about in Daniel 11:34. Islam didn't just kill all the Jews. They would give them the choice of becoming the dhimmi, which means they would have to pay a tax and basically be like indentured servants. But they survived. And that's what it's talking about. That's how little the help has been for the Jews for 2,000 years, allowing them to survive. What's amazing is they didn't acclimate and accommodate and assimilate. They remained a distinct people as the dhimmi in Islam. Another example is if you read A Woman Rides the Beast by Dave Hunt, it'll give you all the information you need on that. But under Roman Catholicism, when the Roman Church overtook a place, and then later after 1564, when they had the Great Schism and the Eastern Orthodox Church broke off from Rome, every time they took over an area, they would either force them to convert or banish them. You say that's help? Well, they didn't just kill them. They let them survive. How many of you knew, here's just a few examples like Nostradamus. Nostradamus is, I don't recommend you read his stuff because he's a seer and he used a bowl of water to divinate and everything. But his family was Jewish who converted just to be able to survive. And those stories down through the history, that's the little help. Very little, just enough to survive. Another example is during the Nazis, they called the righteous ones a remnant of people like Corrie ten Boom. There's Dietrich Bonhoeffer and some of those that are well known. They were the righteous ones who provided very little help. They couldn't really do much more than that, but that's all they could do is they gave them a hole in the ground to hide in. Fed them just enough to keep them alive. They could only have enough clothes to survive. That's the little help. And then one last one's today's peace process. You look at the Balfour Declaration and how much land they're supposed to have, and now Israel has become this anorexic-looking country the size, smaller than Rhode Island, I think. About the size of New Jersey. Very little help to survive. All of that is a fulfillment of what Daniel was talking about there. He says they'll be hoping with a little help. And it says, many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And that's another very strange thing if you study Jewish history through 2,000 years, is that the Jews have still been maintained by God to such an extent that people still wanted their help. After what I just described, that's a very strange thing to say about a group of people. But you know what I'm talking about. The unsaved either attacks or cleaves to the Jews. Because why? And I know what I'm going to say is totally racist, but it's what everybody says. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm saying this is what people say, and we know it's true. They control the banks, they run the media, they fund the wars. And so what's happened? Through the years, you'll constantly see this. Do you know that it is a wealthy Jewish merchant who is credited with saving the revolution here in the United States of America? And I should have looked his name up. But the story didn't come to my mind just now. But our soldiers being the revolutionary soldiers in the United States of America, were without shoes, without ammunition, and George Washington was writing Congress and begging, and they weren't sending him anything. And so this Jewish banker loaned a large sum of money to the United States Treasury. They then bought the shoes and everything they needed. They never paid him back. He died poor. Someone has recently added up how much money we owe them. And let me tell you something. The $2.6 billion a year we give to Israel in federal foreign aid is a drop in the bucket. With interest and accruals, the amount of money they would owe that man and his family who are Jews makes that pale in comparison. So that's what that is fulfilled. I mean, it's just so amazing. And then in verse 35, read that with me. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Now, that is telling you that there will be among Daniel's people some who believe and understand. It's referring to Messianic Jews is what we call them. Christians. You know, the Apostle Paul was a Messianic Jew. The apostles were Messianic Jews. And they, it says, will fall. You know, all but one of the apostles were killed. They were martyred. And to purge and to make them white. And that's speaking of their redemption, being saved. Meaning that because they came to an understanding and followed the Lord, then they gave their lives. And they would not deny their Messiah. Through the years, as I said, from the apostles to modern believing Jews all over the world, only some, it says, believe. And those some fall and are made white and pure. Now, you'd have to do some research on this, but I'm trying to think. There was a book out that I read not too long ago that gives a testimony of the remnant of Jewish believers for 2,000 years. There's always been a remnant of Jews who have believed the gospel and been Christians. And some of the greatest names in church history were from a Jewish background. But speaking of today, you've heard of people like Jay Sekulow, American Center for Law and Justice, Moshe Rosen, who began the whole Jews for Jesus movement. There are all kinds of names that you throw out there. There were trying to think of the man's name who There's an evangelist in the early part of the 20th century that Billy Graham was saved under. His name, but he was a Jewish believer. So through church history, you find that kind of thing. And it closes in verse 35, it is yet for an appointed time. Or it is yet for a time appointed. I want to emphasize that over and over. That all of this is for a time appointed. That you're talking about your situation, you trust the Lord. And that's the same attitude we have to have about what's going on in the world situation, with prophecy, current events, world government, all these things. God is in control. And it is yet for a time appointed. What? The time of the end. The time of the end. When finally the Jews, Daniel's people, are no longer going to be persecuted. No longer going to be killed. That is coming to an end, but it's for a time appointed. And that reminds us of how Jesus left when he ascended to heaven. After Jesus was crucified, buried, and rose again, his followers come up and said, will you at this time restore the kingdom? And he responded exactly the way Daniel did. He said unto them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his own power. Again, Jesus and Daniel going back and forth. It's just an amazing thing how they complement each other, and it'll complement your study as you go through that. So it's a fascinating faith-building exercise to do what we're doing in the book of Daniel. And I see some of you even taking notes. I hope you will make it a project to take the messages we've studied eventually within a few weeks, especially, like I said, with the help I'm getting. I'm hoping to have most all of these on video and be able to put them back there on the table, maybe even just in one set where you can go through and at your leisure follow along and take all of this in, because it will build your faith in this book. And that's the whole point. We understand God's got his blueprint right there in front of you. God's plan is right there, and he's doing it. And if you go through something that is difficult, you go through a time of trial, which all of us, I'm sure, we have our stories. Some of us just share what they're going through now. This is one of those times where you sit and think, wow, think about the Jews. And you think about the remnant of believers among the Jews and what they've gone through. But even with all of that, they can have this faith and knowing that God is in control. And it is going to come to an end at the time appointed. Amen. Be sure to visit our website at kjvbiblebelievers.com, where you can find a wealth of MP3 audio message downloads, along with additional videos, articles, and links. This message is brought to you by Bible Believers Fellowship, P.O. Box 662, Worthington, Ohio 43085. I am Greg Miller. Thank you for listening.